let me stop sharing.
There is part of your metaphor that I want to kind of take apart and look at again, which is the normal distribution. The idea that there are people who handle complexity better than others and so on. At some level, of course, it's true that technical people have been trained to handle certain complexities. Doctors handle complexities that we cannot. Mathematicians who know a certain specialty handle complexities that we do not. But to characterize cybernetics as a group of people who are somehow better at handling complexities may be doing it a disservice, because the ideas of cybernetics are in fact very simple, and they are as simple as understanding that I have the freedom in a civilized situation to comment on what I say and to comment on what you say and to be in the conversation. And that freedom of being in the conversation is, in a certain sense, like our Declaration of Independence, an inalienable right for anyone who speaks a language. And so for all people who are at the level of persons who speak languages in the world, cybernetics is actually meaningful. Can be meaningful.
As long as they start accepting it. But we have spent since 1964, almost 60 years. We only have 75 members. That is a hard fact that we need to reflect on. Jamie, your microphone is off.
Yeah.
You need to.
So you mean 75 members all over the world, or just in the United States?
He means the United States.
No,
Yeah.
I mean I mean all over the world for this organization. Because
okay.
I just asked somebody in association in charge of the membership, and they tell me the secret. Oh well, so we need. I mean, it's a little bit embarrassing, but we really need to face that fact and reflect what have we done wrong, that we are not doing as good as the other three organizations I mentioned. They all relevant related to this interactive, self-referential, personal growth, group growth, organizational growth. Actually, they're all in the same direction of where cyberneticians want to go, but they are doing much better than us.
So in your metaphor, the growth is important.
If it is something really beneficial, it should benefit more people instead of just 75.
I think one of the issues is that most disciplines have an object that they're dealing with that they ironically call subjects, but they're not subjects themselves.
Yeah.
The subject materials, we actually call them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But what cybernetics is in the designing, in the action, in the languaging, so there's no object. And so in a sense, because we deal with this second order subjective lenses through which we see, it's hard to call it a discipline. And interdisciplinary doesn't do it because it's more integrated than that. And second point, Jason, is your emphasis upon the K through 12 and college curriculum. 20 years ago, I helped start a Quaker school here, that's still going, up here in Maryland. And what's interesting about Quaker thinking is that it was really based upon a rebellion against the Western tradition of the Bible and Genesis, because our Judeo-Christian Islamic world is all based upon the same creation narrative. And as a cultural anthropologist, that's the one of the portals you look at a culture through, is to see how they create their creation narrative, which influences ultimately their truth function. In the West, if you use Paul's words, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was good, blah, blah, blah. So that was an extraction, an abstraction of the Word from the experiences, from the subjectivity, from the nature. And that has been one of the keys to our majesty of Western civilization and our misery. Because through this abstraction, we're able to then create gunpowder differently and use it for different things. So the ability to abstract has now gotten to the point where we're too abstracted from the real world, and we're locked within our own words and ideologies. So what you're talking about is in elementary school, you're learning the symbolic system of your culture. You're learning the logic, it's true. The middle school, you're opening up the mind to see the world, so the questioning. And then in high school, because in colleges now, the traditional idea of critical thinking, etc., has now become more certification, technical job growth. So I think focusing on the practice of education is one avenue, and in the growth of design and designers using, so cybernetics is a theory for design.
And design can apply to any field.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. What I found interesting is my presentation is a little bit similar to, I mean, I'm just taking note of Jason, because I also was looking at it from the perspective of the survival, and not just what is it, but how does it live? Yeah. But I could not help go back to the earlier point that was being made, that if cybernetics is about perception, or that perception is really important, then we have this the alternative, and that's again interlocution. And one could even argue in the womb, the baby, as soon as it's sentient, it hears the voices, the sounds around it. So it is in communication, or it hears the world. So it is in a relation already with the world that has nothing to do with perception. So that perception is something that got forced upon us as important, but that may be the problem. That we really need to put it in on the back burner. So it's still important, but on the back burner. And on the front burner, again, communication. What I kind of heard in your talk is we all need to become excellent negotiators, because that is what it is really about in communication. But does our educational system encourage us to be good negotiators or not? Like, what is it that we're taught in kindergarten? I mean, what is like the first thing that we're being told? Now, I'm a little behind, but in my knowledge, but I've read at some point that actually 4-year-olds are doing fascinating things with metaphors. And so that we need to rethink, like, what happens to a 4-year-old? Like, how do we help him further develop the capacity and how to relate with the universe and ask questions? Or does it go in another direction where we want a certain normal? Jason, so I've also a question about your normal metaphor. Do we want a normal distribution, and in order to make it normal, we start like programming the mind for certain things that we think should be in the middle? and maybe we're programming for the wrong things. So so I like to go back to this question of the importance of putting the interlocution and design. Obviously is very important if you think about processes as negotiation, because you, well, actually, I take that back. They are separate questions, but they influence. So what I'm getting at with the question of design is like the whole thing about the zero sum versus positive sum game thinking. And so I never heard about that until I was in graduate school, but how we are really, our society is making us think in a zero sum game. And now we will think differently about design and negotiation. Now in a positive sum game, like in a positive sum game, there always will be a solution if you work hard enough. And in a zero sum game, it's more like, okay, whatever you get, I don't have. So it's not really about problem solving anymore.
I wanted to ask you about metaphor. When you speak of metaphor, how are you thinking about a metaphor? I have a tendency, for example, to make a metaphor about metaphor, saying that metaphors say that A equals B, like Juliet is the sun, say that A is equal to B, when in fact A is distinct from B at some level that is understood, and yet at another level A is indeed coincident with B.
What I discovered was that there are actually 3 or 4 and maybe many more theories of metaphor. So it kind of begins there, that you have to kind of make a commitment to some theory and now from there go further. What I hear in your model is that you assume there is, or actually I didn't hear it. You say A equals.
Well, let's take a metaphor. Yeah. Juliet is the sun.
Yeah.
How do we handle that? Well,
right.
we visualize Juliet, we visualize the sun. We know that the metaphor is saying, is talking about the qualities, the quality of shining that belongs to both. But the metaphor says, is the sun, and takes us farther. It takes us farther. It denies the distinction that we make.
All right. Okay, I'm just going to jump right in the middle. So in that particular example, I see an interaction. So I don't see a literal that is used figuratively. I see an interaction by the concept of the sun and Julia. And so they both bring out something that wasn't there maybe before. So Julia makes us think about the sun in a certain way, and I'm assuming it's in a positive, a warming, sparkling, uplifting. But the sun can also be scorching and deadening and something you're running away from. And I'm assuming you're not talking about those qualities. But then I want to make point B. There are really very different theories of metaphors. And so I'm more going to the one of Stephen Pepper, who kind of organizes all philosophical thinking in systems. And each system, he says, can be reduced into some childhood experience that was used kind of in a metaphorical way to develop an entire cosmology. And so in that definition, a metaphor is an experience with my body that I'm familiar with, that I'm kind of using to say something about the unobservable. And I do this in the hope that the person who is listening recognizes that experience and translates it back into So he hears this metaphor and is able to translate back and understand what I'm trying to say about the unobservable. So I tend to think of metaphors as the things we use to talk about all these unobservable entities that we have assumed exist from the beginning. So it starts with the creator that we set up as a designer or a controller or a father figure or a mother figure. So there's some unobservable.
Some finding of commonality.
Yeah.
When I was little, I had learned to say wheelbarrow, and my Uncle Harry came to our house with a new car, and I don't remember this myself, but the parents remembered it, and so I said wheelbarrow to his car. Yes.
Yeah.
And the adults thought that was very funny, because Uncle Harry, of course, was not as insulted. But if an adult had said that's a wheelbarrow, he would have been insulted.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a distinction between what Lou is talking about in terms of fractals, which are patterns that are repeated at all levels, and metaphors, which are expanding and linking contexts of what you're saying, Jamie.
I certainly wasn't saying that fractals are metaphors, although they are a certain kind of metaphor.
They are a certain kind. And what's important about a fractal is there's a meta pattern that's then repeated.
Fractals are a form of structural metaphors, I would say, or you could call them orientational. I haven't decided there yet. As a higher level form of structural metaphor, but I definitely would consider it something that is being used, structural metaphor, important to develop common ground while we're talking about those unobservable processes. And one of them, of course, is what's happening in the human mind. Okay, and then a quick footnote. So there is this two guys, Lakoff and Johnson, or it's called cognitive linguistics, and they're their whole theory of metaphors. And they made a huge difference with their book Metaphors We Live By really pushing the idea of metaphor in the center and normalizing it. However, when you read their work, they actually say we're a machine generating metaphor. No, we're a metaphor generating machine. So they don't really go to the bottom, I think. To go to the bottom of how we use metaphors, we need to go to Stephen Pepper, who says, yes, we can think of ourselves as a machine, but that is just one metaphor or root metaphor, and there are other ones also. So that I think in a way, this Lakoff and Johnson are really confusing the picture, because they very selectively look at metaphors and they totally ignore other ones. And the ones that I'm personally really interested in is just like purely structural metaphors, like independent of machines, but just the structure. And then also the discursive metaphors, this is when we use language. What sort of metaphors are we using? And I haven't really found a book that I think satisfactorily addresses this. And you see, I've all these books around me because I'm looking for one, and so I may end up writing it myself. But I'm not an English major, so I'm still hoping to find some comparative literature PhD who's willing to.
If we started on Jason's engineering side, we would begin with analogy and then let that shade into metaphor. And that might be a way to analyze it for Jason, or for Jason's point of view.
On top of that, Jamie, you may want to be considering what Jason talked about in terms of an error detecting lens.
Yeah.
How do you detect errors? And thus you have to bring a truth function in there somewhere. You can connect everything to everything, but that's doesn't really give you a pathway or map or navigation capability?
Well, I came from Karl Popper, and Karl Popper, it's through Karl Popper that I noticed the discursive metaphors. And he's all about learning from mistakes and detecting errors. And the way that I address that issue is, I think we're dealing with different ontologies, so to say. The making of mistakes, I will be dead if I make too many mistakes. I will be disadvantaged. I won't be sitting here. So the reality kind of takes care of the mistakes, and it's our foolishness to refuse to address mistakes. And I think we're right now figuring that out at a societal level with COVID-19. And so then there are our knowledge, our objective knowledge, I think, are our texts. Like a text, it keeps on existing even if we close our eyes and if we die. The text is still existing and it doesn't change. And so I think that is what helps us get to the invariance, that we all look at the text and we say we agree with it. And so that gives us the invariance, and then the text acts as a guide or a lens, or it reduces some of the total haphazard, ad hoc, random behavior. But to get to that, we need to have relations, and that is a World II issue, where we trust people, and that we know they're not lying to us, that they're not deluding us, that they're not manipulating us. And I think we have, like, ever since the Soviet Union, the 1950s, we have a science of disinformation. So it's not in our imagination. We know there is a possibility for manipulation. And there happens to be a Darwinian hypothesis that actually fits the bill. You probably, I don't think it's as popular, but maybe, sorry, it's called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. Frank de Waal, that they kind of said that that he kind of noticed that there are certain members of the cohort that kind of suddenly acquired this ability to kind of understand that they're manipulating others and that they can do things with it. And so they can put it either to good use or they can put it to bad use. And so that gets us back to the objective knowledge that we have developed. It allowed us to do all these awesome, wonderful things like building computers and networks. But there needs to be trust, and that because we don't have the certainty, so we need to trust that the other has good intentions, and somehow that trust is being eroded. That is what I would say from where I'm sitting now.
Okay,